Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're looking at sources that investigate a really fascinating tension. It's the point where heritage preservation, especially with political buildings, stops being an act of care and becomes more of a conversational barrier, an argument for paralysis. You've brought us sources looking at this through the lens of one of the most famous political buildings in the world, the Palace of Westminster, and specifically how conversations about real, necessary institutional change can just grind to a halt. The moment someone says the word historic, it's like a veto. Now, let's be really clear here. The importance of a place like Westminster, its history, its symbolism, that's not in question at all.
Yeah.
But our mission today is to ask, what exactly are we protecting when we use that heritage argument? And is it actually helping or maybe hindering the institution's ability to function?
That's the core question, really. The source material forces us to be incredibly precise. We have to separate the layers. Are we protecting the building itself, the way it looks, the way it's been used over time, or, and this is the key bit, the way politics behaves inside it? And the sources point out something critical. These things overlap, of course they do, but they are not identical. Yet in the public conversation, we tend to slide between them, without really noticing. We use the need to preserve the stonework as an excuse not to challenge the behavior inside. And that's the slide we need to stop.
Okay, let's unpack this then. And let's start with maybe the biggest assumption of all, the myth of the untouchable chamber. There's this feeling, I think, that the House of Commons chamber is ancient, medieval even, just always been there exactly as it is. But the sources remind us of this one foundational fact. The chamber we see today, it's a product of necessity. It was bombed in 1941. It was destroyed.
Completely.
Which meant they had to make these huge decisions about rebuilding, adapting, maybe even abandoning it. And they had to do it fast under incredible pressure in the 40s and 50s. And crucially, at the time, nobody saw this as vandalism. It wasn't a betrayal of history. It was just necessity. Parliament had to work. The function came first.
What's so fascinating there is the contradiction. If rebuilding it completely back then, and that included changing things, adapting technology, if that wasn't a betrayal of heritage, then the sources argue it's very hard to say that careful, measured change is automatically won now. Home. And this point is really driven home by an anecdote the sources highlight about Winston Churchill's role in that rebuild. He was the one who insisted on keeping the confrontational layout, the benches facing each other, not enough seats for everyone.
Ah, the famous tight space.
Exactly. And his reason was explicit. He looked at other parliaments, the U-shaped ones, and said they encourage coalition, they encourage collaboration. He wanted the narrow adversarial layout because he thought it reinforced the two-party system. He wanted confrontation.
So the architectural constraints we see today aren't some accident of ancient history. They are a deliberate post-war design choice, a choice made to encourage a very specific kind of politics.
Precisely. So we aren't protecting an ancient design. We're protecting a 1950s design philosophy about behavior. And this is where the sources say preservation starts to, fail us a bit. It starts as care, but it can harden into reluctance to touch anything at all.
Yeah.
And you end up with a living place that starts to feel, as one source put it, a little embalmed.
The embalming effect, that's a really striking phrase. It suggests that what's being preserved is the appearance of history, maybe at the expense of the institution's actual health.
Right. And the result is this kind of systemic rigidity. The institution becomes harder to adapt than it needs to be.
Yeah.
And preserving how the chamber looks just crowds out any real curiosity about whether its function still works.
Which brings us perfectly to the next point. The fact that Parliament is already adapting physically all the time, just selectively. The sources suggest we need to think about change differently, maybe even think about the idea of reversibility. Change doesn't have to be this huge permanent loss. You can try things. Temporary layouts, trial arrangements. These are ways of learning how a space works when you use it differently. They're about discovery, not destruction.
And we already see this logic everywhere in Westminster, just without the big heritage debate. Think about all the changes that are already accepted. The ones that have totally altered the space.
You mean the infrastructure that's just part of the background now?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Accessibility changes. That was a necessity, and it was done, even though it affected the historic structure or the broadcasting infrastructure. All those cables, lights, cameras needed to put it on TV. That completely changed the building. And, of course, security.
Security is probably the biggest one. The changes are massive.
They really are. The sources point out that security needs have fundamentally altered how the building works, how people move through it. You have restricted zones, fortified doors, whole wings repurposed. None of that was part of the original design. It's all incredibly intrusive. And yet, we all frame it, quite rightly, as an adaptation to new realities. We accept huge, permanent physical change when it's for safety or for logistics.
So if the security doors and the broadcast rigs and the accessibility ramps are all fine, then the physical building can't be the real issue, which raises that uncomfortable question the sources ask. If it's not the stone, then what is it?
And that's the heart of it. Why do some changes like a camera rig feel acceptable, while others, like maybe rethinking the seating, feel totally out of bounds? The conclusion the sources come to is that often it isn't really about the stonework at all. What makes people so uneasy is the possibility that behavior might shift, that, confrontation could soften, or that hierarchy might blur, that politics might look a little less theatrical.
So the heritage argument becomes a stand-in for something harder to name. It's not always about protecting the past, it's about protecting familial patterns, even if those patterns aren't really working for modern government.
Exactly. It's protecting the incentives that are baked into the current structure.
That's a huge conclusion. But before we get there, we have to deal with the counter-arguments. People resist this idea for real reasons, and we need to give those objections a proper hearing. So let's start with the big one. Objection 1. Isn't this all just symbolism? Shouldn't we focus on actual policy?
Well, the sources argue that symbolism is almost never neutral. And we're not introducing symbolism here. We're just acknowledging the powerful signals the space already sends. Parliament takes symbolism incredibly seriously. All the ritual, the language, who sits where. So clinging to the old arrangement is already sending a signal that the history of confrontation is the most important thing. The question isn't whether there's symbolism, but whether that symbolism is actually helping.
That makes sense. Okay, let's take on the stronger one, the one tied to how democracy works. Objection 2. Politics is meant to be adversarial. Isn't that the whole point? Disagreement is vital. Isn't a slightly theatrical debate better than deals made behind closed doors?
And this is such a crucial distinction the sources make. Adversarial doesn't have to mean performative. And challenge doesn't have to be staged as combat. You need robust disagreement on policy. But staging that disagreement for the cameras, for a headline, that's performance. The sources ask, does the environment have to amplify that confrontation so much? That narrow space, it was designed for a certain style of 19th century oratory. It's inherently theatrical. And if that nudges politicians towards shouting instead of detailed scrutiny, well, then it's actually undermining the legislative work.
I think that line, the one between adversarial debate and performative spectacle, that feels like the absolute core of this whole argument.
It really is. And it connects to the other worries. For instance, objection number 3. Wouldn't changing the space just make things weaker or more vague? But that worry assumes that clarity only comes from confrontation. The sources look at other complex, high-stakes environments. Think about an appeal court or a team of engineers designing a bridge. Where does clarity come from in those systems?
From structure, from process, documentation, having enough time.
Exactly. It comes from structure and process, not from, as the sources put it, volume or posture. You get clarity by designing a good process, making sure ideas are properly dissected, not by having two sides shout at each other.
And finally, the objection that is so often used to just shut the conversation down. Objection 4. Isn't talking about benches a total distraction from real reform?
The answer from the research is, look, it would be a distraction if you treated it like a silver bullet. If you said, change the architecture and you fix politics. Nobody's seriously suggesting that. But if the architecture is a source of active friction, if it actively rewards behaviors we say we don't want, like performative politics, then fixing that friction isn't a distraction. It's an enabling reform. It removes a barrier to getting to the kind of governance we say we want.
So none of those objections are trivial, but when you look at them through this lens, the idea of heritage as an absolute veto really starts to fall apart. So let's bring this all together. What does this mean for a place like the Palace of Westminster? How should we think about its heritage going forward? It seems to demand a real shift. If heritage is more than just aesthetics, it has to connect to the institution's actual purpose.
Yeah.
And what is that purpose? It's representation, it's scrutiny, it's legitimacy. And as the sources say, those values don't live in benches or sightlines. They live in how Parliament actually works.
We have to prioritize the legacy of functional legitimacy over the legacy of appearance. A chamber that, as one source says, quietly rewards performance over patience. Well, it isn't more authentic just because it's old. It's just inherited a set of incentives that haven't really been looked at since the 1950s. The final reframing here is so important. Adaptation isn't a threat to history. It's how that history continues, how it stays relevant, instead of just hardening into a ritual nobody understands. Heritage should make us slow down, be more careful, and think really hard about what we're truly preserving. Is it institutional health, or is it just a 70-year-old stage set?
That's the key, isn't it? Preservation should force careful thought, not just end the conversation. So, to wrap up this deep dive, we've really landed on two key points from the sources. One, architecture alone doesn't fix politics. And two, history does not forbid careful, necessary change. The lesson seems to be separating the desire to preserve how a place looks from the need for it to work. And ultimately, the sources conclude that the strongest pressures on what happens in Parliament don't come from stone or timber. They come from incentives.
And that leads us to the final provocative thought for you, the listener. If we accept this idea that space shapes behavior, but that the building isn't the only constraint, well, then our focus has to shift. Building on the sources, we have to ask, once you live that heritage veto, what are the other powerful incentives shaping the institution that we almost never talk about? Things like the intense pressure of short electoral cycles, the media's constant focus on conflict, the rigid demands of party discipline. Those are the conversations that can begin once we realize the building is only part of the story.
A deep dive into that political landscape is one we look forward to having with you next time. Thanks for joining us.